Here's a number that should concern every seller on the Monterey Peninsula. In June of 2025, over 57,000 home sales across the country fell apart after going under contract. That's roughly 15% of all pending deals, the highest cancellation rate for any June on record. And that's just the national number. On the Monterey Peninsula, where we're dealing with properties from $1 million to $35 million, a failed deal doesn't just cost you time. It costs you positioning, momentum, and often hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm William Smith with the Carmel Luxury Group at Coldwell Banker. After 36 years selling real estate from Carmel to Pebble Beach to Big Sur, I've seen deals fall apart for almost every reason you can imagine, and a few you probably can't. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 5 deal killers I see most often on the Monterey Peninsula, and more importantly, what you can do to prevent each one. If you saw my last video, we talked about the 3 questions every seller needs to answer before they even put a sign in the yard: who your buyer is, what your real timeline looks like, and what you're actually selling. Those questions are about strategy, about setting yourself up for success from day one. Today is about what happens after you're already in contract, because getting an offer isn't the finish line, it's the starting line of a whole new process. And nationally, the data tells us that roughly 6% of contracts are being terminated outright, and another 15% are experiencing significant delays before closing. So let's get into it. Here are the 5 things that kill deals on the Monterey Peninsula. Number 1, and this is the one I see trip up sellers more than anything else: inspection surprises. Here's a statistic that's worth knowing. 86% of home inspections uncover something that needs attention. That's not 86% of bad homes, that's 86% of all homes. Nearly every property is going to have findings. Now, in a normal transaction, findings are just part of the process. The buyer's inspector identifies issues, both parties negotiate, and you move forward. That's how it's supposed to work. But here's where it becomes a deal killer, especially in the luxury market. When a buyer is spending $2, $3, $5 million on a property in Carmel or Pebble Beach, they have certain expectations. They're often coming from a professional environment where due diligence is standard practice. They hire thorough inspectors. And when that inspector comes back with foundation concerns, outdated electrical systems, or evidence of water intrusion that the seller didn't disclose or didn't know about, the trust factor takes a hit. And once trust erodes in a transaction, everything gets harder. Nationally, 46% of buyers use inspection findings to renegotiate the purchase price. And on average, those renegotiations result in a $14,000 reduction from the original list price. Now, $14,000 might not sound like much on a multi-million-dollar property, but in my experience on the Monterey Peninsula, the issue is rarely the dollar amount. It's the principle. When a buyer discovers something they feel should have been disclosed up front: deferred termite work, a roof that's past its useful life, drainage issues during the rainy season, they start wondering what else they don't know. And that's when deals unravel. The most common findings that cause real problems are structural in nature: foundation cracks, roof deterioration, electrical that doesn't meet current standards, and evidence of moisture or mold. On the peninsula specifically, we see a lot of issues related to age. Many of our properties are decades old, combined with our coastal environment. Salt air, fog, moisture, these take a toll on roofing, siding, and particularly on anything below grade. So here's what I recommend to every seller I work with. Get ahead of it. Order a pre-listing inspection before you go to market. Know what your property's condition is before the buyer does. This accomplishes 2 things. First, it eliminates surprises. You can either address issues proactively or disclose them up front with full transparency. Second, and this is the strategic part, it puts you in control of the narrative. There's a meaningful difference between a buyer discovering a problem and a seller presenting a solution. One creates doubt, the other builds confidence. Let me paint you a picture. Say you have a beautiful home in Carmel, great location, ocean views, everything a buyer would want, but underneath the house there's some substructure where you've never had reason to look at, and the electrical panel is original to the home. You might not even think of those as issues. They've never caused you a problem, but a buyer's inspector is going to find them. And when those findings show up on a report the buyer is seeing for the first time, it raises a question: what else might be here that we don't know about? Now contrast that with a seller who orders a pre-listing inspection before going to market. Same house, same findings, But this time, the seller already has repair bids in hand. Maybe they've addressed the electrical. Maybe they've disclosed the substructure condition with full documentation and context. When the buyer's inspector comes through, there's very little that's new. The conversation shifts from what are they hiding to they've been thorough. Same property, same condition. But the experience for the buyer is completely different, and that difference is often what keeps a deal together. Deal killer number 2, pricing that doesn't match reality. And I want to be specific about what I mean because this goes beyond just overpricing your home. Here's the broader picture. Nationally, 21% of sellers reduce their asking price at least once before finding a buyer. And in the Monterey County market, properties are currently averaging around 39 days on market. That's significantly longer than what sellers experienced just a few years ago. Now, pricing itself doesn't technically kill a deal after you're under contract. What kills the deal is the downstream effect of how you price. Let me explain. When a property is priced above what the market will support, one of two things happens. Either it sits and buyers start wondering what's wrong with it, which means when you do finally get an offer, it's often from someone who feels like they have leverage, or you get an offer from a buyer who's stretching and their financing is fragile. Both of those scenarios create risk during the escrow period. But here's the deal killer that catches a lot of sellers off guard on the Monterey Peninsula, the appraisal. According to NAR's most recent Realtors Confidence Index, about 5% of contracts nationally experience delays specifically due to appraisal issues. That might sound small, but consider this. On a $3 million property, an appraisal gap of even 5% is $150,000. That's $150,000 that someone has to account for. Either the buyer brings additional cash, you reduce the price, or the deal falls apart. On the Monterey Peninsula, appraisals are particularly tricky because our market doesn't behave like most markets. We have properties where the view alone accounts for $1 million difference between two houses on the same street. We have homes with historical significance, architectural pedigree, properties on the Pebble Beach golf course, and finding truly comparable sales for these properties is genuinely difficult. And this is where the Monterey Peninsula makes things especially challenging. Our micro markets are so distinct that an appraiser who isn't deeply familiar with the area might pull comparable sales from a completely different market segment. Imagine a home in Carmel by the Sea being compared to recent sales in Seaside or Marina. Those are different buyer pools, different price drivers, different lifestyles. But if the comp set doesn't clearly support your price, that gap between what the data shows and what you're asking gives the appraiser reason to come in low. The solution starts before you ever list. You need a pricing strategy built on recent, relevant, comparable sales. And on the peninsula, relevant means within a very tight geographic and feature set. You also need a broker who understands how to build an appraisal case. That means preparing a comp package for the appraiser, being available during the appraisal visit, and making sure the appraiser understands the nuances of the property and the neighborhood. 20% of buyers are currently waiving their appraisal contingency altogether. Those are strong, committed buyers, often cash buyers. The way you attract those buyers is with pricing that's credible from day one, combined with a presentation that justifies the value. Price it right, present it well, and you attract the kind of buyer whose deal doesn't fall apart. Number 3, financing that falls through. And nationally, this is actually the single biggest reason deals collapse, accounting for roughly 35% of all canceled contracts. Now, you might think this is primarily the buyer's problem, and in one sense it is, but if you're the seller, a financing failure costs you weeks or months of market time and you're back to square one, often in a worse position than before. Let me walk you through how this typically plays out on the Monterey Peninsula. You accept an offer from a buyer who's pre-approved. The pre-approval letter looks solid, but pre-approved isn't pre-underwritten. It means a lender has done an initial review. It doesn't mean the loan is guaranteed to close. Between acceptance and closing, that buyer still needs to go through full underwriting. And during that process, things surface. Maybe their debt-to-income ratio is tighter than initially calculated. Maybe they had a job change. Maybe they're self-employed and their income verification is more complicated than expected. In the luxury market, I see complex financial situations regularly. Buyers with income spread across multiple entities, large stock portfolios they're planning to liquidate, international assets. Any of these can cause a delay, and some cause a collapse. Here's some important context on where the market is right now. Mortgage rates in 2025 have ranged from about 6.15% to over 7%, depending on the month. That volatility matters because a buyer who qualified at 6.2% may not qualify at 6.8% on a multi-million-dollar purchase. The payment difference on a $2 million loan between those two rates is significant. Meanwhile, 28% of all purchases nationally are all-cash transactions, and 30% of repeat buyers paid all cash. On the Monterey Peninsula, that cash buyer percentage is even higher, which is actually good news for sellers who know how to attract those buyers. Here's what I do to protect my sellers. First, we scrutinize every offer's financial strength before we accept it. A pre-approval letter is the minimum. I want to understand the buyer's lender, their down payment source, whether they have appraisal gap coverage, and whether they're liquidating assets to close. Second, if we have multiple offers, financial certainty weighs heavily in my recommendation. A slightly lower all-cash offer with a 21-day close is often stronger than a higher offer with financing contingencies and a 45-day escrow. Third, I maintain communication with the buyer's agent throughout escrow. I want to know immediately if there's a hiccup with the loan, not 3 days before closing. The goal is simple. By the time we accept an offer, I want to be confident that the buyer can actually close. Everything after that is execution. Deal killer number 4, and this one is particularly relevant in California: disclosure and legal complications. California has some of the most comprehensive seller disclosure requirements in the country. The transfer disclosure statement, the natural hazard disclosure, the preliminary title report. These aren't optional. They're legal obligations. And on the Monterey Peninsula, we have additional layers that many sellers don't anticipate. Let me give you some examples. Coastal Commission jurisdiction. If your property is anywhere near the coast and in Carmel by the Sea, Pebble Beach, or Big Sur, that's a significant number of properties. There may be restrictions on what can be modified, expanded, or rebuilt. Buyers who discover these limitations during their due diligence period sometimes reconsider the purchase entirely, especially if they had renovation plans. Historic design guidelines. In Carmel by the Sea, there are specific architectural standards. You can't just knock down a cottage and build a modern glass box. Some buyers love that character, others see it as a constraint. Either way, it needs to be disclosed and understood early. Easements and access issues. In areas like Carmel Valley, Cassagua, and Big Sur, I've seen properties with shared road agreements, utility easements that cross the property, and water rights issues that are genuinely complex. These aren't problems per se. They're realities of owning property in these areas. But if a buyer's attorney discovers an easement that wasn't clearly presented, it creates friction. And then there's the title itself. Preliminary title reports sometimes reveal liens, boundary disputes, or encumbrances that the seller wasn't fully aware of. In luxury transactions, where properties may have been in families for generations, title issues can be surprisingly complex. Here's the pattern I've seen. The seller thinks, "My home is beautiful. The location is perfect, nothing to worry about." They complete the disclosures, but they're not thorough, or they don't understand the significance of something, like a neighbor's fence that's actually 6 inches onto their property, or a septic system that predates current regulations. The buyer's team does their homework, they find the issue, and now instead of a smooth negotiation, you have a legal question that requires attorneys, delays the timeline, and introduces uncertainty. The prevention here is straightforward. Disclose everything and disclose it early. I walk my sellers through every disclosure form personally. I ask difficult questions about the property's history, past insurance claims, neighbor disputes, known defects, any work done without permits. It's not comfortable, but it's necessary. I also recommend ordering the preliminary title report before we list. If there's a cloud on title, I want to know about it before a buyer does so we can address it proactively. In 36 years, I've learned that sellers are almost always better off over-disclosing than under-disclosing. A known issue with context is manageable. A discovered issue without context is a deal killer. And the fifth deal killer, and honestly, this might be the most common one I encounter, is emotional decision-making on both sides of the transaction. This is the deal killer that doesn't show up in any statistic. You won't find it in the NAR data or the Redfin reports, But in my experience, emotion derails more transactions than any single contractual issue. Here's what I mean. On the seller's side, you've lived in this home, you raised your family here, you have memories attached to every room, and when a buyer's inspector writes up a list of findings or when the appraiser comes in below your expected value, it doesn't feel like business, it feels personal. I've had sellers refuse reasonable repair requests because they were offended that the buyer dared to ask. I've had sellers reject strong offers because they didn't like the buyer's tone in a letter. I've had sellers pull their home off the market entirely because the process felt disrespectful. On the buyer's side, it's often cold feet. Nationally, buyer circumstance changes, which includes simply changing their mind, account for about 17% of canceled contracts. That's nearly 1 in 5. And on the Monterey Peninsula, where many buyers are purchasing a second home or a retirement property, the stakes feel different. It's not a necessity purchase, it's a lifestyle choice. And lifestyle choices are more susceptible to second guessing. Think about this. Say you've got your home under contract at a strong price. Good buyer, solid financing, everything looks great. Then during the inspection period, the buyer asks for a credit. Maybe $5,000 for some routine maintenance items. Standard request happens in almost every transaction. But after 20 years of taking care of this home, it's hard not to feel like that request is questioning your effort. And that feeling, even when it's understandable, can shift how you respond. Maybe the negotiation gets a little more rigid on both sides. Maybe the buyer starts to feel like things are heading in the wrong direction. And sometimes what started as a straightforward conversation turns into a stalemate. The deal falls apart, not over $5,000 really, but over how it felt. That's the kind of situation where, months later, a seller looks back and wishes they'd had someone in the room who could see the bigger picture in the moment. Here's what I tell every seller I work with. The best real estate decisions are made with good information, not strong feelings. My role is to be the buffer. When a buyer makes a request that feels unreasonable, my job is to translate it, to help you understand the business rationale behind it, and to recommend a response that protects your interests without escalating the situation. Every negotiation in a real estate transaction is a conversation, and conversations go better when someone at the table is thinking clearly, looking at the data, and keeping the end goal in focus. That's what 36 years of experience is for, not to tell you what to feel, but to make sure decisions are based on strategy, not frustration. So, 5 things that kill deals on the Monterey Peninsula. 1, inspection surprises, and the solution is a pre-listing inspection that puts you in control. 2, pricing that doesn't match reality, which leads to appraisal gaps, weak buyers, and stale listings. 3, financing that falls through, which is why we scrutinize every offer's financial strength before we accept. 4, disclosure and legal complications, especially in California where transparency isn't just good practice, it's the law. 5, emotional decision-making, the invisible deal killer that costs more sellers than any of the other 4 combined. Here's the thing, none of these have to end your transaction. Every single one of them is preventable with the right preparation, the right pricing, and the right guidance. And that's what the Carmel Luxury Group does. We don't just list your property and hope for the best. We build a strategy that anticipates problems before they happen. And we manage the process from listing to close so that when a deal goes under contract, it stays under contract. If this was helpful, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel and share this with someone who might be considering a sale. The more people we can help prepare for this process, the smoother things go for everyone. Buyers, sellers, and the agents working to bring them together. If you're thinking about selling, whether it's a home in Carmel by the Sea, a ranch in Carmel Valley, an estate in Pebble Beach, or a retreat in Big Sur, I'd welcome the conversation. Reach out to us at carmelluxurygroup.com. Let's make sure your transaction doesn't become a statistic. I'm William Smith. This is our second installment of the Knowledge Broker series, and I'll see you in the next one.